Hello, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. I'll keep my eye on the chat box in case anybody wants to say they're having problems with audio. Hello. Hello, and welcome to the Leave Canada Books webinar on print on demand as an export tool. Thank you all for being here. It's 1 o'clock on the nose, and if anyone comes in late, I'm sure they will get the gist of things as they log on. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Gabrielle Echeverry. I am the Communications Manager for Leave Canada Books, and I'm simply here today to facilitate the Q&A session and introduce our host, Marc Leslie Lefebvre. So again, thank you all for being here. The presentation should take about 60 minutes in total, and we set some time aside at the end for your questions. Please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function on the bottom right-hand side of your screen throughout the presentation, and we'll just collect them throughout, and then I'll sort of present them to Marc at the end of his presentation. For those of you who would be interested in reviewing parts of the presentation or having access to the PowerPoint that Marc has put together for today's session, we should have those up on our website along with the recording of the presentation of the webinar itself in about a week. So we'll let you know when they're there, but feel free to take a look if you're feeling impatient. Of course, if you encounter any problems or have questions relating to the platform throughout the webinar, please message me privately through the chat function, and I'll be happy to help in any way that I can. Of course, you can also do that through the Q&A, but we're hoping that most of the questions relating to Marc's presentation will be added into that chat box. So, again, welcome to everybody. Thanks again. As you know, print on demand is an excellent tool offering publishers the flexibility and control to print just-in-time inventory on an as-needed basis while helping to reduce warehousing and shipping costs. With POD, publishers can take advantage of print local options all over the world, saving on expensive shipping, warehousing, and frustrating time delays, as well as reducing the carbon footprint. We're excited to be learning about this technology's increased potential today, and I'm delighted to be introducing our presenter, Marc Leslie Lefebvre. Marc is a writer, editor, bookseller, and a digital publishing evangelist. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what that is later, Marc. And he has worked in the book industry since 1992. He's consistently leveraged emerging technologies within the publishing space, including an accessible online platform for publishers of all sizes, implementing print-on-demand technology at the bookstore at McMaster University, and founding the indie publishing platform Kobo Writing Life for Recruit and Kobo. Marc's industry experience includes roles as president of the Canadian Booksellers Association, board member of BookNet Canada, director of author relations and self-publishing for Recruit and Kobo, director of business development for Draft to Digital, and professional advisor for Sheridan College's Creative Writing and Publishing Honors Program. He's spoken about opportunities within digital publishing throughout North America and Europe. So welcome, Marc, and thanks again for joining us. And so I'll now turn over the mic to you, and I'll turn off my video so we can get started. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Gabrielle. And thank you for Leave Canada Books for this opportunity to share something that I'm really excited about. And I'm hoping that there's probably going to be a lot of things that you're very familiar with already with relation to print and print on demand, but I'm going to kind of go through the basics. And I'm really excited to share about some of the possibilities and opportunities that I think are ahead for us. So already a little bit about me, but we're going to talk a little bit about that just to give you a bit of a background. I can't help but share personal anecdotes from my own experience working with publishers and authors and platforms over the years. I'm going to get into a brief history of print on demand, talk about offset versus print on demand. We'll explore a bit of the difference between POD and short-run printing in this wonderful gray area in between. We'll talk a little bit about pricing and economics because that's very, very important, obviously, with book distribution. I'll share my introduction to the wonders of POD and how that made a significant difference on my own path as a publisher and as an author. And then I want to talk about quality because that's always very, very important for publishers is what's the look and feel compared to real books or books that are printed posted in the traditional offset manner. What formatting options exist for print on demand, which is actually quite a bit larger than it was the last time I had the opportunity to share my experiences about print on demand with this wonderful organization. And then what are the distributors and wholesalers who are some of the players involved? Mostly from personal experience. There's as Hamlet said, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy ratio. And there are more options that I'm going to have time to get into. That could be a whole day of talking, but I'm going to just give you some high-level examples just so you can get a feel for it if you're not familiar with it. And then what are the POD setup requirements, which I think is important to go over at least at a high level. How can you leverage print-on-demand opportunities for export, for international sales, and even for domestic sales that are not local or don't require having warehousing. And then, of course, examples of how publishers are doing this, examples of collaborations that publishers are doing with bookstores and with creators. And that's kind of the high-level view. So we talked a little bit about my background. So I have been a published author since 1992, which is the very first time that I started working in the book industry and got bitten by the book bug. I am a writer, editor, publisher, consultant. I'm speaking to you today from my home office here in Waterloo, Ontario, where I've been fortunate enough, well prior to the pandemic, to have the opportunity to work from home. I have loved the work I've done managing bookstores and working at head offices over the years, but the commute into Toronto was getting to be a bit of a challenge. Even in Waterloo, when I first started driving out there, I could leave at 6 in the morning to get into the office for 7:30, and then over time I had to keep crawling that back until I was leaving at 5:30 in the morning. Fortunately, I come from a long line of fishermen. My dad trained me to get up early, and now I've been taking advantage of that early morning rise just to get some writing done before the regular workday from home begins. As mentioned already, I played roles of president of the Canadian Booksellers Association. I'm very, very passionate about books and book selling and libraries and the whole relationship between what this industry does to connect a reader and a writer. And that's what this is about, is putting those two together. And of course, there's a lot of logistics involved. I loved my time when I was a director at BookNet Canada and love the amazing work that they do. Definitely worth checking out the resources that they have access to. They are a plethora of wonderful information for Canadian publishing and bookselling in general. And I did leverage their tools as a bookseller to great success. I'm currently the founder or chief reflective officer of Stark Publishing, which is a company I created initially in 2004, and I'll explain why I created that company way back when. I currently work part-time as Director of Business Development for Drafted Digital, and we'll even share something they've been up to related to print on demand with a print partner, and love the work that I've done with on the Professional Advisory Committee at Sheridan College's Writing and Publishing Program, which is the first degree program about writing and publishing, and not just the craft of writing, but something that I feel is really, really important, not just for people going into publishing, but authors to be aware of, is the business aspect of the publishing industry, even from the point where when an author is pitching a book to you, the publisher, having them understand what makes economic sense for you as a publisher, and not just pitching it on the feels and all of the great things that this book can be, connecting the reader and the writer, which is the job of publishing in many ways, but actually looking at the logistics of, is this a worthwhile investment, which of course is something that we have to apply. Even though we probably got into the publishing business because of our love of books, we recognize there are logistics, and POD is one of those logistics that can really, really help leverage some of that margin that's constantly being tossed about and shared in our industry. I am not, if you have guessed right, I'm not a member of nor a president of the Hair Club for Men. I'm bald and proud of it. I want to go into a brief history of POD first. And so Frederick Pohl, science fiction writer, in the 1966 issue of the Galaxy science fiction magazine, he shared in this essay a proposal for a high-speed facsimile machine that would produce a book to your order anywhere in the world. And he claimed that this was surely going to be the shape of the publishing business sometime in the future. Well, this was still early days. When you think of science fiction is often a platform that allows people to speculate and marvel about the wonders of what could be possible. When I think back to movies like Arthur C. Clarke's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and you saw in the movie and in the text, you saw what became an iPad. They were reading news on a screen device. It kind of looks something like what Apple ended up producing not that long ago, which really revolutionized information sharing and the pinch and zoom screens and things like that. Even L. Ron Hubbard, science fiction writer, had the vocal recorder, which was a digital device that kind of predated or speculated about what became an ebook. Arthur C. Clarke has also written some amazing books. One of the ones I marveled at was a story he wrote where these kids were fascinated. They were looking at this old ancient artifact called the book, and when they turned the page, the same words were always on the same page as before, and it was this remarkable invention that they had never seen because they'd only ever read on digital devices. Well, I do not believe that we are ever not going to have the printed book. The printed book still represents between 70 to 80% of the overall book publishing industry, and the average person who has read a book, and unfortunately there's not the average person who hasn't read a book since high school, but the average person who has read a book, the majority of them have still not discovered ebook publishing. So even though I am a digital evangelist and I love the things that can come from digital books and print on demand, I do know that the print world is here to stay. It's going to probably change and be enhanced by some of these technologies, but it isn't going away, and we need to embrace both those worlds together to see where we can take it. So speaking of science fiction, I wanted to kind of go into Robert J. Sawyer, science fiction writer, a dear friend of mine, a mentor to me in many, many ways, and many other science fiction writers here in Canada. And Rob is a member of the Order of Canada as well. And Rob, in his 1990 novel Flash Forward, which you may recognize, which was turned into an ABC television series starring Joseph Fiennes, Flash Forward was a novel that actually had a scene in it that speculated a bookstore that people could go into and order from his digital catalog. So at the time, Chapters and Indigo were two separate companies when he wrote this book, and I have to admire an author like Rob because he has a scene in the novel that's set in an Indigo, and then he has a scene in the novel set in the Chapters because he was covering his bases probably for scenes he could read in the store at either one of those chains. But he has a scene where they go into Chapters, and they're trying to get this book that's out of print. And the stores at the time would carry anywhere between 75,000 to 100,000 books, different titles in the store. A mall store or a smaller form store like an indie bookstore typically would carry anywhere from 5,000 to 15,000 titles, just to give you an idea. But even at that date, that early date in this new digital publishing world, there was still a small percentage of the books that were available. So in this particular case, they go into a bookstore, the book is not in stock, it's not in print, it's not sitting in a warehouse anywhere. It's something that can be printed in the store. So they go into the coffee shop that's attached to the bookstore, and they wait for this book to be printed. 10 years later, if you fast forward, the picture that I'm showing is of Rob and I at the McMaster University bookstore in front of the McMaster University Press, or Titles on Demand, which is McMaster Innovation Press was for the academic side, and Titles on Demand was a more customer-facing side from walk-in traffic. But that was an espresso book machine, the ninth espresso book machine in the world, and the second in Canada. And so it was 10 years after Rob speculated about this in a book that he was launching one of the books in his Wake Watch Wonder series, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to get a photo of him and myself in front of that machine, and I did make a point of asking Rob, or telling Rob that I would be studying the Wake Watch Wonder trilogy that he was in the process. I think he was launching book 2 at the time in that series, and speculating on whether or not there would be something in that book that would predict where I would be in 10 years. Now, the one thing I did find, just a little trivial fact, is that Wake Watch and Wonder is in Waterloo, Ontario. Now, at the time, I was living in Hamilton, and lo and behold, 2020 hits. He did not predict the pandemic, but I am living in Waterloo, so I'm curious to read Rob's latest books and see where I'm going to be in another 10 years. So print on demand was born out of a lot of different revolutions, a lot of different stages in publishing. 1968, the dot matrix printing was introduced. 1969 was when Xerox actually invented the laser printer. Now, when we think of laser printers, at least as the common person, not as a publisher or a production person, we think of the laser printers that are now affordable and in our homes, which didn't happen for a long, long time. But the original laser printing was, well, the year that I was born. So it goes back quite a bit. Water-based ink came the year later. And then this is significant as Project Gutenberg, the oldest digital library of public domain books, was launched. And ironically, when you think about, wait a second, digital books back in 1971? Well, they do say that life begins at 40, and it was roughly about 2010 when the ebook really, really took off, and that kind of solidifies that thinking, because ebooks or digital books in a different format were constantly evolving and growing until they finally came of their own at the age of 40. So 1981, of course, the internet was developed, and that was still, the days of the information superhighway, and a lot of it only through academic environments, government, and universities and colleges and things like that. And then desktop publishing was introduced in 1983, but it really took off in 85. And I even remember back in the days as a young boy who would sit at a typewriter and type away, wanting one day to be a writer. I remember wanting for Christmas nothing more than software. Now, this is prior to Microsoft Word, and I believe WordPerfect may have been, Corel WordPerfect might have been a thing, but there was a software called Paperback Writer. And my parents got me a knockoff of it called Pocket Writer, but worked just the same way. This is, home desktop publishing, and that was probably on my Commodore 64 computer way back in those days. Xerox came up with the DocuTech, which dramatically had an impact on later technologies we'll talk about. This is where you could scan, electronically edit the files right there, connected to a computer, and then you could start the printing on demand. The PDF, a remarkable innovation in digital publishing, probably one of the most dramatic and important, came out, the PDF in 1993, because that really was the basis and foundation for the next phases of print on demand. Then you had localized print on demand with the espresso book machine, which is still, when you think about it, in its infancy, when you think about the way that technology can continue to evolve. And then, of course, now that in 2020, we have expanded POD formatting options and trim sizes beyond what was a minimal viable offering to something that can be very comprehensive and satisfy different publisher needs, not just standard trade publishers looking for trade paperbacks of the normal variety. So I want to talk a little bit about offset versus POD just to lay the groundwork for that. So offset, this is where ink is transferred from a plate, and it goes on the rubber sheets. It's rolled on the paper, and all of that is being fed through a printing press. These large sheets of paper are then cut into a book shape, and they're sent either to another department or sometimes even a different building or company to be bound and stitched into book form. Now, the majority of print publishers produce books in some sort of offset manner in this way, and that's usually of quantities of 1,000 or more. Now, there's obviously setup costs involved because you can't just crank things out. You have to take the time and care to set things up. But there's a lower per unit print cost, which is a huge benefit for offset, which leads to having to print potentially more stock than you may be reasonably able to sell in a limited time period, sitting on that stock, which requires some warehousing. You're probably quite familiar with that already. Now, print on demand is files basically can be directly created from digital file, PDF. Now, printing typically only happens when an order is placed by a customer. Now, that customer can be a bookstore or a library. That customer can actually be a one-off customer shopping on an online bookshop. And so the nice thing about this is that the ideal print run in some cases is a single copy. There are some offset stipulations with some print-on-demand printers where they actually technically are printing for, because cost-effective wise, it makes more sense. And sometimes they end up doing a minimal warehousing method, but that's just sort of the logistic operations that they're still figuring out. But the beauty of POD is that there's lower minimal setup costs. There's a lower risk of investment at the front end of creating a book, and the warehousing costs where you can really save significant amounts of money. Never mind the shipping and all of those distribution nightmares, including the reverse shipping. What happens? We'll talk about returns a little bit. I know that's a pain point for many of us. And then, of course, there is a higher per unit print cost. So it's not all sunshine and rainbows. There are some other margin considerations to take into effect. Now, the difference between print on demand and short run printing is, so long run printing is typically more than 1,000 units, or 1,000 units or more. And then you think of short run printing is typically 50 to 500 units. Now, it can be lower and it can be higher. And it doesn't mean that short run printing can't get into higher volumes, but usually those are the averages that you get in there. And short run printing can do perfect bound, case bound, or Smythe sewn, saddle stitch, coil, wire, O-bound, board books, right? All kinds of different possibilities. Now with print on demand, ideal one copy or more. Again, it's not as scalable, and the typical formats, like the majority of the formats that most people think about, were initially trade paperback, perfect bound trade paperbacks, and even hardcovers in more cases. Now we're seeing a little bit of a merger between those two worlds, a bit of a blending, where you're using print-on-demand technology for the interior, but then you're applying some of the short-run printing binding steps in a way that's scalable to create almost like a print-on-demand in the other formats. And we'll kind of show that in a bit. And the technology is getting there for less and less manual intervention, which again helps save the cost of labor, which reduces the per unit price. Now, again, with print on demand, you're going to get higher per unit costs. You start relatively reasonable, but they don't really go that much lower with volume the way that they do with offset printing. So it doesn't drop as the volume goes up. What does save you money is it reduces the amount of speculative inventory printing that you have to do. And that can really eat up your budget quite quickly, because you may be speculating your print run based on the conception of what the sales team and the marketing departments are speculating the orders will be, and that can change. Let's say, for example, in Canada, a significant amount of decisions may be made based on the buyers at Indigo, or the buyers at Costco, or the buyers at Walmart, or one of those large brands that is going to buy in larger volumes. You're also, of course, going to get orders from independent bookstores as well. So you take a look at what you're speculating the orders will be based on the market conditions that you understand them to be, and you're planning your inventory and planning your sales based on these values. And sometimes the print quantities that you initially speculated would be far, far higher than the ones that end up getting ordered because other market conditions suddenly change, which, again, we have no control over. You do have reduced shipping costs because you're not just shipping from the printer to the warehouse, or the warehouse to the bookstores, or whatever the downstream market might be, and potentially shipping back from the bookstore to the warehouse and figuring out whether you're going to sit on them or if you have to destroy them, as obviously new titles, new seasons, you can't keep everything all the time. And returns are a significant thorn in a publisher's side. So a lot of inventory and a lot of margin and a lot of costs are involved in that storing and then the restoring of stuff that gets shipped back. We saw, for example, and speaking of unpredictability, pandemic times, 2020 saw major chains like Indigo and Barnes & Noble that, ate up a lot of orders and a lot of stock from a lot of publishers, suddenly closed and not able to sell. And in a lot of cases, there were significant issues with returns. Now, these kind of returns can happen seasonally, and they can happen various other factors and changes in the industry having worked in the industry for a long, long time, I do remember times where there were massive purges of inventory stock, and publishers were basically asked to bear the cost of all of that. Well, that was a significant and painful moment in 2020. I'm sure many of you felt that in significant ways. Potentially some of you who were involved in print on demand were fortunately able to leverage the fact that there were a lot more orders being done, either through online bookstores or, in the case of here in Waterloo, I was placing a lot of my orders through Wordsworth Books. And I know a lot of the books that I ordered were actually print-on-demand books, because many of the titles I wanted to get were from indie authors who had already set up these print-on-demand titles, but I wanted to buy them through a local store so I could support them. But anyway, so that's about returns. But then the other thing, of course, is the carbon footprint. In general, you could be a better global citizen in terms of the shipping and the storing and the destruction of books, or even the costs involved in remaindering the books, because it's really just trying to reduce your losses when you're selling those remainder titles. But there are, just like there are opportunities for publishers for grants to publish Canadian authors, there are opportunities for publishers to receive carbon-related funds. So probably more of those coming in the future. So again, some of the economics may be related specifically to savings you can get from print on demand. Some of them may be related to the way that you do business as a global citizen. Now, I want to go back to one of the reasons I'm a little bit biased towards print on demand, so the wonders and even some of the hiccups of print on demand. So I started writing short stories, and I came to a point in 2004 in my writer journey where I'd had a whole bunch of short stories that were published, but usually after 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the contracts I signed with the various publishers, with the magazines, anthologies I had been published in, I had the rights reverted to me. So I was sitting on this IP, or this intellectual property, that was just sitting there, just like a story sits in a drawer that you don't send to a publisher. Now, I worked in bookstores since 1992, the first year I was published. And I had all of my publishing done in short stories, because the going recommendation to authors was build a name for yourself through short fiction, and then maybe once you have some credits when you submit your manuscript to an agent or publisher, then maybe then they'll see that you're a published author, and therefore you're worthy of elevating yourself through the slush pile. So that was the going rate or the going methodology at the time. And it was frustrating for me, because I was working in a bookstore and people would say, "You're a writer." And I'd say, "Yes, I'm a writer." And they would say, "Where can I find your writing?" And I would say, well, first of all, you have to get in your car and you have to drive about 6 hours to the border and cross the border. And once you get into the state of Michigan, you will find there's a bookshop that has one of a magazine, limited circulation, 500 copies, and my story is in that. But oh no, it's November 17th, and it was only on the shelf towards the end of October. So it's no longer available, actually. And I had nothing to do. I had nowhere to turn to people to prove that I was a real writer that actually had works published. So I saw a solution that had come from print on demand. And I'm going to share the example, and I'm also going to share the costs of what was involved. So this was back in 2004, where I used Ingram Lightning Source. Now, Ingram Lightning Source was meant for publishers. Many of you probably very familiar with Ingram Lightning Source as a solution, but you typically have to know what you're doing to make your way around. I had commissioned my best friend, Steve, to create a one-hand screaming cover for me, which is basically a collection of my previously published short fiction. I got some quotes from various writers who had either bought my work or had known me in the book industry, like Julie Cherneda. My very first pro sale was to one of her anthologies through a Canadian publisher, Robert J. Sawyer, Nancy Kilpatrick, other writers who had ironically advised me, don't go into self-publishing because it's the best way to kill your career. But I did. I did it with a caveat, because I thought that perhaps the fact that these stories had already been edited, had already graduated through the slush piles, gave them that sort of stamp of approval. So I knew that they weren't necessarily garbage, although they are kind of Twilight Zone horror stories, so a lot of people might look down on them as garbage, but I thought that it had some sort of literary merit to it, so I felt justified in doing that. But I used print on demand to create One Hand Screaming, paid my best friend Steve, who was a graphic designer, to do the cover design for me, which basically cost me a case of beer at the time, which is about $24, and the setup cost through Ingram was about $300. So that's a setup fee plus the per page fee. And there was a $12 US cataloging fee to keep it in print on demand, which I do still pay every year because I end up making more than it costs me to keep that book alive as a print on demand title. I was retailing it for $12.95. The print cost was $3.90 per unit. There was a 40% discount, of course, going to bookstores, which you're all familiar with, which kind of left me with a $3.87 margin per unit. Now, a couple of the things that I did set up was sort of a mistake. So because I worked in the book industry and because I knew that most bookstores are very unlikely to order and stock books that are print on demand because they are usually by default non-returnable, and there's still a bit of a stigma associated with print on demand because they're usually associated with self-publishing. But I set it as the deepest discount I could. I set it as fully returnable, and it worked really brilliantly for me because as an author who was traveling a lot for work, I could call up Chapters or an Indigo or a Barnes & Noble or an independent bookstore and say, I'm going to be in town in 3 months. My book's available through Ingram. It's fully returnable. I'd love to come in and do if it was a downtown location, so a lunchtime book signing because I know that's when the crowds are there, or if it's a more mall out in the suburbs, maybe that's an evening or a weekend event. And it was great until one of the buyers at Chapters, who probably knew me through the industry and liked me, went and ordered 600 copies of the book to put them in stock at 300 stores. So you're basically getting 1 or 2 copies of the book spined in a store where nobody knows it's there. Nobody really cares. It's never faced out, which meant about 6 months later, when half of the books came back to me, it ended up costing me a little bit more than I earned in the sales because of the fee you have to pay for a returned title for destruction. But that was my learning, so it was a little bit gun shy. Most of the books that I have set up as a small micro publisher, I've usually made them non-returnable by default, with one exception. I did make some hardcovers fully returnable through Ingram in this past year, because I know that the higher price point means no one's likely to buy it in any mass quantity. And when I was at a BISG meeting in New York last summer, I remember speaking to a representative from the Ingram team, and she had shared during a print-on-demand presentation there that Ingram's overall returns, even on POV titles, were approximately 1%. I just happened to have been in that 1%, which was a little bit scary for me. Now, the quality and the look and feel of print-on-demand books are virtually indistinguishable from an offset printed book. One of the ways I can tell, and I call this the bookstore library back page test, is, and this is an example of one of the titles that I've printed this year using print on demand. That's a trade paperback. I can't remember if that one came from Lightning Source or KDP Prints, or it might have been through IPG. I can't remember because I work with multiple solutions. But you can open the back and you can see the little barcode. You can often see where it was printed, and that kind of gives you an idea. That may be one of the only ways that you can tell. There's a couple other fine things that if you're a purist related to offset printing, you can kind of tell. But for the most part, the average consumer can't tell the difference at all. The formats you can see here are just some of the examples that I had laying around: trade paperback, hardcover, case bound, jacketed. Large prints. I'm going to talk about faux leather, but I want to share large print. So what you see, this large print version is Haunted Hamilton, which is Dundurn, one of my publishers, Canada's largest independent publisher. And that was my first book with Dundurn. And I was thrilled to see that Haunted Hamilton was available in large print. And what you can tell just by looking at that book is obviously there was no large print cover designed. It was just the regular cover with a logo put on it. And it was probably some sort of special request from a customer who wanted access to this book. was not able to read ebooks, which every ebook can be a large print book because you can change the font size. And they set it up. I found it online and thought, wow, for my vanity shelf at home, wouldn't it be really cool to have a large print book? But the cool thing about that is that it's not all that hard to set up large print books. For example, if you're operating on a Mac, there's a piece of software from Vellum that works brilliantly in order to have a template to allow you to click out print ready large print file from a regular file. And a lot of indie authors that I've been working with in the last couple of years are now starting to make their books available in large print as well, because they know that even though they do well in ebooks, that large print, there's still a lot of print readers who are print purists, and they would rather have the large print version, even though it costs $15, $20 more. But again, it's print on demand, so you don't have to stock it or store it in the warehouse. So some of the other options that come from Ingram, and I specifically used Ingram because they had some nice pictures and descriptions on their website. And so obviously you have paperback and hardcover, the two most popular ones. Now, the cool thing is hardcover you can do with or without a dust jacket. You can do the plain cover with a dust jacket. You can have the dust jacket that actually has the branded cover as well. And you can have both. You can have the cover. Now, obviously, when you have the cover file and then the jacket file, you'd actually have to submit 3 files rather than 2. But that's just, it's a great option to have available, especially if you have some purists who want the hardcover and they want to collect it in hardcover. That's again, it may not be for the higher volume of sales, but even if you do a launch specifically to trade paperback, I remember, for example, Kelly Armstrong, it's published through Random House Canada, and I remember her first book that came out bit was in hardcover, but the second one was either released straight to mass market or straight to trade paperbacks. When I look at my shelf of signed copies of books, it was like, rats, I wish I had a hardcover of book 2 so they all look nice together. So that's something that you can make available, for those diehard fans. And the cost of setting it up just for online orders, not worrying about distribution, could potentially be worthwhile and satisfy some of those collectors and fans. Now, the textures, you've got your matte and your gloss cover, and then there's this digital cloth cover, which is this cloth-like look that you can get with or without dust jacket, textured feel, and that's available through Ingram, printed in the U.S. and the UK only, which we have access to shipping from the U.S., so it's not so bad here. Binding, again, perfect bound, saddle stitch, case laminate, and even jacketed case laminate, which is pretty significant. Ink quantities, you get black and white and color. I remember doing some color orders for clients through the bookstore at McMaster University, which were quite amazing. And you can get some premium color printing as well, which obviously is going to be a lot more expensive. The color and paperweights, starting off with 38-pound groundwood, or you've got white and cream, 50 pounds, and even higher, 70 pounds for some premium, and that's more for color printing options. Now, the wholesalers, again, I mentioned this before, but there's a lot more, but here are just some of the high-level distribution and wholesalers easily available. So obviously Ingram, the world's largest wholesaler. When I managed a bookstore, it was a place where I could get special orders, often because it's coming from the U.S. and there's import laws in Canada. I wouldn't use them necessarily for stock, but I would use them to fulfill special orders. And sometimes in emergency situations, when the Canadian publisher was out of stock for a significant amount of time, I would use them. But again, the cost of shipping was a little bit prohibitive. But they are the world's largest wholesaler, and most bookstores anywhere in the world can order from Ingram. And they are probably the world's largest print-on-demand service provider. So Lightning Source was initially created specifically for publishers, and this is publishers that had all of the files, all of the tech in order to upload their titles and make them available. Well, a few years ago, they launched Ingram Spark, which is kind of like a more user-friendly and Fisher-Price kind of look and feel. So think about Lightning Source has all the bells and whistles. Ingram Spark has maybe about 60% to 75% of the bells and whistles, but also walks you through things step by step for those who are maybe newer publishers or smaller publishers that don't have the same larger departments doing the tech, that can just kind of walk through setting up the files in the right formats, walking them through all kinds of support. And so that's being used by a lot of the really, really small publishers as well as authors because it's a bit more of a friendly interface than Lightning Source if you're not familiar with it. So there's kind of two choices there. Now, Amazon loves Amazon. There's a lot of nepotism within Amazon, but they have Amazon KDP Print, which used to be CreateSpace, which was a separate company. Then Amazon bought them, and then over the years, finally merged them into a much lesser company, KDP Print. Now, CreateSpace was relatively great to work with. It's really great customer service. But now that it's KDP Print, it's kind of the customer service and a lot of the perks there kind of went by the wayside. But that's for Amazon only. Okay, world's biggest bookstore, great. But not necessarily for beyond. Now, they have an option in KDP Print, Kindle Direct Publishing Print, called extended distribution, where they claim that the books will be available to libraries and bookstores. The downside, and the reason I call this pretended distribution, is because all the books are by default short discount, because Amazon wants to keep most of the money, not publish it. Not pass that on to the bookstores. And a lot of markets, having managed an independent bookstore myself, I would have felt threatened when someone tells me, oh yeah, you're ordering it from the enemy that's trying to put you out of business. So, you know, a lot of publishers may not be willing to want to go with that platform, even though it's completely free to use, right? Unlike Spark or Lightning Source. Although I should say Ingram Spark has recently announced, and I have it written out, free 2020 setup fees, because there are setup fees, $49 to set up your books now through Ingram Spark, and you can have that waived, at least for now, if you're watching this, you know, sometime in 2020 still through Ingram. But Amazon KDP is free, but extended distribution is not really much of an option. Draft to Digital, which is an ebook company out of Oklahoma in the U.S. that basically has free tools to convert a Word document into EPUB, and publishers can use that at any time for free. Don't even have to use them for distribution if you want to save money on conversion. But they also have a partnership through IPG, Independent Publishers Group, actually Ingram's largest client, who also runs a print-on-demand service. And technically, a lot of the print-on-demand services that are out there that do distribution through the book chains are ultimately using Ingram. And even using the printers in a lot of cases. But Draft to Digital has a methodology, again, free setup, where it goes through IPG, their partner, to get that extended distribution. So if you're thinking about distribution in that format, you're probably looking at something like Lightning Source, Spark, or potentially Draft to Digital for getting that extended distribution beyond that Amazon. And then there's local Canadian examples. There's so many across the country. I'm most intimately familiar with M&T Printing here in Kitchener. I've been using them for well over 10 years for local author copies, and when I needed extra stock, even to sell them to library wholesalers here in Kitchener area. And more recently, Rapido in Montreal, Quebec. I met them years ago when I worked at Kobo and have done quite a number of jobs with them recently, and some of the really cool options they have available, which I'm going to get into in a bit. So the basic setup requirements are the interior is black and white, the PDF is print ready, the fonts need to be embedded in the PDF, 600 ppi for black and white line art, or 300 ppi for the 8-bit grayscale. The color is usually grayscale by default, saves you more money. 175 LPI. Now the bleed is usually on average, typically 0.125 inches or 3 millimeters, except on the binding, so it's around the exterior. And the margins are usually recommended about half an inch or 13 millimeters. For the cover, the basic setup again is print ready. You've got the simplex one-page spread, or the duplex is the two-page PDF, depending on the file you're setting up to send to them. The fonts, again, have to be embedded, similar resolution. Now, the color is CMYK typically. Again, 175 for the LPI. Again, you've got a similar bleed on the sides, and there is a bit of a differentiation you may notice with some print on demand too. The type safety, so they recommend being like a 1/4 inch in from the edges on all sides, just to be safe. And then, of course, there's spine type safety as well for how to determine that spine. But your designers probably already have this. If you have design, if not, these are really handy requirements you can get right off their website, like from Ingram, for example. Now, no spine text is usually allowed on Perfect Brown books with page counts below 48. I've done that myself when I had a little printing service, but again, it's really, really tricky and not recommended. Now, the benefits of this is the repurposed content. So multiple formats. You have a single file that you can produce paperbacks, hardcovers, large print versions using software like Vellum that's relative, it's like about $100 US for a license to use that for anything you want. But unfortunately, it's only available on a Mac or special limited editions that you can do. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that through Ingram. Now, the side effect of multiple formats is that you immediately multiply your discoverability of your titles in an online catalog. So it's not just listed once. It's listed as trade paperback, hardcover, potentially large print, etc. And the more listings you have, the more likely it's going to cross over in one of those formats in terms of discoverability. The customization, which I'm going to get to, is the Ingram Special One-Off Customization, which is a really cool option. Now, hybrid publishing solutions is a really, really popular one. And this is something that I know Dundurn has done among other really adept publishers. So the idea of the hybrid publishing is that you're never out of stock. So for example, you do your initial print run. Let's say it's an offset print run. You do 1,000 copies. And then within Ingram's system, if you're using Ingram as a warehousing, is you can have it set to default to just-in-time inventory instead of out of stock. So not only do you provide them with copies that they sit in their warehouse, if they run out of stock, it flips to print on demand while you're still in the process of getting the extra stock to them, because you either had to get more printed or they're in a warehouse here in Canada and you're getting them shipped, et cetera, whatever. But that way, your book never disappears from availability. Think about like the Giller Awards. I remember the Sentimentalists. I was managing a bookstore, and I still hadn't received my copies of this book. Now, this book was a handcrafted artisan book from a wonderful small publisher on the East Coast. But I was really frustrated because I was running a bookstore and I had customers that wanted to buy it, but I couldn't get stock of the Sentimentalists. Even though, ironically, I did have a machine in my store, had actually met the publisher at the Gillers and said, "Hey, I know this is art, but I could help. I could print some for my store, and you could make sales right away, and I could even provide them to Brian Prince's bookstore just down the street." I mean, there's lots of happy customers. But again, that was an opportunity where I realized that the ebook was never out of stock, and suddenly the print book was. So this just-in-time inventory means that when the offset printed book runs out, you don't run out. You actually have that just-in-time POD inventory. Now, Rapido Flex for publishers is a really cool program I learned about, which is you can print only what you need. So let's say, you get quotes based on print runs, and with Rapido, it's more like a short run printing where you actually get better volume with higher title publishing. So let's say your initial print run is only 200 copies because it's limited market and you're just testing out the market because you're not sure what's going on because of the pandemic or whatever. But then if they've got this set up in the system for you, if you need another 75 copies or 20 copies or 50 copies or whatever, you're not paying the higher rate. So 75 copies would normally cost you $7.88 per unit, but you'd be paying $6 per unit, which is your 200 copy rate. So you still leverage the benefit of the higher quantity over time. So that's a really cool option and opportunity for writers. Now, other examples are, so Dundurn, as I mentioned, one of my publishers, great publisher, they use a UTP distribution for warehousing and distribution here in Canada, but then they use Ingram for distribution in the States. Now, some of my titles, for example, like Haunted Hamilton and Spooky Sudbury and Creepy Capital and Macabre Montreal are all very Canadian-based books, and so therefore their distribution is not really going to expand much outside of the territories in Quebec and Ontario. There may be one-off orders that are ordered through print on demand to a customer, for example, in California or Australia or whatever. And so Dundurn can have the stock in Canada, but also have other orders go through online booksellers, et cetera, so they can still fulfill them from a quicker shipment through POD from the U.S. Rapido as well has an ARC or advanced reader copy option for Canada and the U.S. And they can do direct split shipments from Montreal, where their office is, rather than from the UTP warehouse. And so, for example, I know they've worked with Dundurn as well to do, shipments of proof copies that need to go to Dundurn's office in Toronto. And I see a typo there. I just said office in, and I should say Toronto. But they also do things where they can drop ARCs directly to reviewers in cities across the country. And that's a great opportunity to save on shipping the books from the warehouse to the office. Then somebody in the publicity department has to then repackage it and go drop it off in the mail. Think about the labor that you're saving in a solution like that. There's also this custom one-off copies I spoke about with special limited print runs. And for example, you can do this through Ingram Spark. So let's say it's a special letter from the CEO to employees because they want to buy this business book that you have, and they want all 100 employees or all 300 employees to have that. You can actually have that inserted into a special print run for them. It could even be a single copy. Maybe it's a letter from the publisher to the potential reviewers that's sent off, or to the bookstore buyers, or whoever it is. And it could be one, or it could be multiple copies. It could even be a scanned signature with a note from the author. So a really great opportunity. Other versions, other formats, I talked about faux leather, for example. Is you think the revenue is generated from repurposed content. One file creates multiple different sources. An example of this, and I didn't have a picture of the book, unfortunately, but I have biology at McMaster University, which was a history of the biology department, which we were printing on the printing press, the espresso book machine at McMaster University bookstore. M&T did a large print run for us because we needed more copies than we could print, in 15 minutes per copy. So when they needed a large quantity, we used them for those, and also used them to create faux leather bound. And this is an example of faux leather, but not the same book because I didn't fortunately get a copy. But it had this embossed cover, biology at McMaster University, and it was the exact same interior, just a different, same size, just a different stock. I've since done that with Obsessions, an anthology I'm publishing through my Stark Publishing imprint, where I have the ebook, I have the trade paperback, I have the hardcover, and then I have two different versions of the faux leather. One is numbered and signed, and the other one is lettered and signed. Limited edition obviously costs significantly more, but it was for members of a Kickstarter who supported that campaign. So in terms of print on demand for international sales, this is just an example of what you can do. You can, of course, negotiate printing with all kinds of different companies around the world, and sometimes negotiating directly can work really, really well in your favor. I remember doing that when I was at McMaster, and even talking to bookstores that had similar espresso book machine print on demand technologies in the store to get copies printed in London, England, so that the author of the book could just walk down the street and pick up a copy. And that was a great way of doing it. But Ingram Global Connect is a great way you can facilitate that without even having to get on the phone with lots of different people around the world, where you can manage your distribution from that single source, that single digital file platform. So you can reach international readers in days rather than having the weeks from your warehouse. So you still have warehousing and distribution in Canada, but maybe you're using the print on demand for that international sales, similar to the way Dundurn would with Ingram for U.S. sales, et cetera. Now, this immediately improves your availability. Take a look at the green where you're actually having Ingram print on demand in multiple continents. Take a look at the distributor relationships, meaning they distribute through, and so there's local points of distribution that reach plenty of places throughout Europe and Asia, and even in Australia. And of course, that does increase your discoverability, because when a customer hears about your book because the author is busy on social media or you've got some great publicity, they can order the book, and it doesn't say ships in 3 to 5 weeks. They can actually say usually ships in 2 to 3 days, or 3 to 5 days, or 1 to 2 days, depending on how close they are to that source. Now, some examples I want to go back to. This is the espresso book machine that I had at McMaster University. It was the world's fastest special order. So Catherine Wiebe was a graduate of McMaster University, and her book from Blue Butterfly Press, small publisher in Toronto, Second Rising, and it was based on her thesis, and they published the book. It was a beautiful story. And in the morning, McMaster University, when you turn on your computers as an employee, the homepage is the daily news, and there's a daily news story about Catherine. So immediately, even before the bookstore opened at 9 o'clock that morning, we were getting phone calls from people saying, "Oh my God, I heard about Catherine's book. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it?" And of course, the news hit before the book was actually ready to be distributed. It was probably going to be another week or two. Sometimes that happens. I guess it's good news that that the demand has come. But I hated missing that demand, and I had a machine in my store that could print the book. So I actually contacted the publisher, negotiated directly with them. They sent me the files. I sent them this agreement, and then basically paid them for every book that I printed and sold through the cash register through the tracking system that we had. And so at 9 o'clock in the morning, we just learned about this book, but at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was already selling the books because I did not want myself or Blue Butterfly Press to miss out on those sales. Other one was Playwrights Canada Press, publisher in Toronto. I had a faculty member who wanted Reading Hebron, wanted that Joseph Sherman play, and it was out of print. And I had a class for 60 people, so I wanted to order 60 copies for the faculty member. And they only had 10 copies in the warehouse, and it was not economically feasible for Playwrights Canada Press to print 1,000 copies just to sell me 60 so I could return 20 or 30 that wouldn't sell, maybe even more, depending on how that worked out. It was not economically feasible. So I had a disappointed professor, disappointed publisher, disappointed me. I talked to Playwrights Canada Press. Again, we created a special contract where I said, hey, if you send me the digital files, tell me how much. I mean, my print cost is going to be whatever. Tell me how much you would want per printed copy. Now, the cool thing is I was able to get this book at a reduced price. Now, with Second Rising, it was a trade paperback from a trade publisher. I kept the initial trade price just to keep everything even, so it wasn't messing up the real book when it came from the publisher. And with Reading Hebron, my goal at McMaster, and the reason I bought the Espresso Book Machine, was I wanted to save students money without costing publishers. And so what we did is we were able to actually reduce the price for students for Reading Hebron in such a way that the publisher made a little bit more money, the bookstore made a little bit more money, and the students paid a little bit less money. So that was a really great example. Espresso Book Machine at University of Alberta bookstore, which was my inspiration for wanting to get an Espresso Book Machine. Jerome Martin, Spotted Cow Press, did some remarkable things where they did a poetry book launch twice in a blue moon with Joyce Harris. You can see the huge crowd that was there. So, academic bookstores aren't often well known for trade sales, but this was a really amazing event. Jerome and even the publishers in Alberta have done some remarkable things with print-on-demand technologies, including even publishing a book about the future of publishing that's still freely available if you Google Jerome Martin and publishing futures. There was also a dual book launch, Squire Davis. So it had local Hamilton connections. So again, they had the book launch in Edmonton. We used, prior to the pandemic, Zoom. We actually had cameras in the store, pointed at crowds in the store, seeing the author on a screen in our store, and printing the books in on the Espresso Book Machine. And it was really, really cool because we could actually have customers in our store in Hamilton, Ontario, speak to the author and ask her questions as if they were talking at an author table. She was actually signing book plates that were mailed to us that we would either hang on to for the customer for when they got shipped to us, or we would just hang on to the book and put it in the book and let the customer know. So it was this really interesting collaboration of two bookstores working with a small publisher. I've walked into bookstores in New York City, in Oregon, and even in Milan, Italy. And I've been able to order one of the titles I set up, Stark Publishing. I was able to set Campus Chills, an anthology I did publish initially at McMaster. One of the clients of mine, Sarah McVannell, Flip Side of Failing, when I was in New York last summer, walked into Shakespeare and Company, ordered her book, had it in my hand, actually recorded a video to send to her and said, look, I just bought your book in a really prestigious bookstore in New York City. So suddenly the discoverability through Espresso Book Machines in stores potentially possible as well. I did speak briefly about Campus Chills. This was an anthology funded by the universities of McMaster, Alberta, and Waterloo. It was designed, the cover was designed by some great folks from Waterloo Printing, and we launched the book simultaneously at 4 different bookstores with all 13 contributors in Hamilton, in Edmonton, in Alberta, as well as in you see Steve Vernon down there, University of Dalhousie bookstore. So we actually had to ship the books to them, but the other locations actually had physical books available. It was a world's first, and also I've continued to publish other print-on-demand titles like that. So the reality of what you can do with print-on-demand is that the technologies are there. You can have the flexibility to have formats and binding and choices. You can have both offset and print-on-demand. You are technically limited only by the limits of your creativity, the limits of your imagination, and the business acumen that you're willing to embrace. The sky is the limit, and technically when we start talking digital, is the sky really the limit? So I think we're pretty close to the hour. It looks like we are on the hour. I think we're going to be opening up to questions at this particular point. And I guess I should ask, should I stop sharing the screen, or how do you want this to roll?
Hello. No, please keep your screen shared.
Okay.
And thank you for this great presentation. I do want to just begin the Q&A session by thanking you, of course, for your for your work, but also for our participants. Apparently, there has been a lot of trouble with people logging in, and so I want to thank you all for your patience, your resourcefulness, and your perseverance. I think most of you made it in, figured out how to make it in, or contacted my colleague and got the information you needed to log on properly. So thanks again for your patience, and I hope you didn't experience any other technical issues while you were here. So we have 2 questions already from the audience, and they are smaller questions, mostly related to, I think, not necessarily sort of broad questions about POD, but one was, I think, asking for clarification about something you mentioned relating to grants for reducing carbon footprint. Is that something that that is out there, or is that something that you know of? For grants to publishers?
I remember reading something about that. What I should have done is I should have grabbed the link to see if I can find. If I can find that, I'll definitely send that over to you so you can send that. But I am pretty sure that there were. Maybe not necessarily specifically for publishing, but for businesses. But there's no reason why a Canadian business can't leverage some sort of benefit or some sort of funding for reducing their carbon footprint. I'll do a bit of a search and see if I can find the article I was reading about that. But I don't have a URL handy to share, unfortunately.
That's great. I'll send it along once we send the rest of the information about the webinar recording.
I'm hoping I wasn't just a wonderful dream that I had that day. Did I read it in a science fiction novel?
Yes, that does happen sometimes. Okay, so we have a couple more questions to go here. Again, one sort of asking for clarification about a point made in the presentation, and one was, did you mention a company or some online website that allows you to convert documents to EPUB? Can you repeat the name and maybe say a little bit more?
Of course. So there are multiple ones available. This is the one I've been using personally to great satisfaction, Draft to Digital. So the word draft, like cold coming in or one of my favorite kinds of beer, the number 2, and digital.com. You can set up a free account there. And all you need is a Word document, and you can get an EPUB and a MOBI if you need to make an Amazon-friendly file for free. And there's built-in templates that you can use. And you don't even need to use them. You can use them to distribute the ebook if you want. But if you're distributing through a different source, you just download the EPUB and you do whatever you want with it. That's one of the free tools I've been using and swear by. Now, I should specify, text-based files like novels, reflowable EPUBs, not at all good for anything that's graphic heavy, image heavy, cookbooks, children's books, anything that you think about as fixed layout that would look better as a PDF because it always had page 1 always has to be page 1, page 2 always has to have this spread. This is for reflowable text-based books, great free tool. If you're going to go with ebooks on that are not reflowable, that are fixed layout, then you probably need to look at a software like Vellum, which unfortunately is very affordable, but unfortunately only available on Macs. So a lot of publishers will have departments where the marketing and the design people swear by Macintosh, so they should be okay there.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a few more questions in the queue. The next one is, could you speak a bit more about large print options and your experience? I lost it as it went. Sorry, could you speak a bit more about large print options and your experience with this? Is Vellum the vendor you know best? As you were just saying, are there others to look into?
Yeah, so I think Vellum was one of the tools that just it just makes it easy, like push a few buttons and they'll create it for you. There's other formats. So I've actually purchased for my own publishing. I actually purchased templates through Joel Friedlander in somewhere, he may be in Australia, somewhere else in the world, and I purchased these Word document templates from him that were meant for print layout, and I've actually done some print books right out of Word. Like, I know it sounds crazy, Word to PDF, just to test it to prove that it could be done. But what I've done since purchasing the templates is I've then, over the years, modified the template to my own specification. Like, I prefer Palatine Lino type, and I prefer a 1.12 space between the lines, and I prefer a font size of X, and I prefer, so my own preferences visually were a little bit different than the template, so I started with the templates and adjusted them. But you can do the same thing with large print to create large print books. Now, the difference obviously is they're going to be typically going to be a different format, because large print, if it's 6x9, large print's going to go off into, or you're going to have a lot more pages. So that's something to consider. But the benefit of large print on demand is you don't have to print 1,000 copies. You can have a one-time charge for your layout person or however you're getting this book into large print. You can have that available, and for anyone who requires print on demand, libraries or customers, or even if a bookstore needs to special order it for their patrons, they now have easy availability. Because here's the thing, if you're looking at a book online and you see that it's available, but it's not available in large print, maybe you skip to the next book that's in large print. If you see the book is in large print already and just listed in an online catalog that either costs you like a $12 a year fee to be live, or potentially through one of the free versions, like through Draft to Digital or through Ingram Sparks, that free setup I talked about, you might not have lost a sale. You might have gained a sale off that. Again, it's speculative publishing, but if it costs very little to create that long tail of customers who could suddenly have access to your books in large print without it costing you warehousing, could be something that's worth exploring. You probably are going to start on frontlist, and then maybe potentially, if it's economically feasible, look at some of your more popular backlist items where you may have had requests come in.
Okay, great, thank you. There's a few more questions. I think we have time for 2 more, but I'll try to combine a few of them because they kind of are relating to the same issues. And one was if you could speak a little bit about, speak to recycled paper and the print on demand with recycled paper, because I think some publishers have mentioned that they find that a barrier to using POD.
Some of the printing services I've used haven't yet adopted recycled paper in. I remember, and this was almost 10 years ago at McMaster University, I remember experimenting with recycled paper for the printing that I was doing. But that's something like, and this may be something that may not be available at every print on demand company. To be quite honest, I haven't actually explored that myself with M&T, which is a local printer that I end up using here in the KW area. But I believe that that's an option that you can always ask. Now, the cost for recycled paper is probably going to be a bit higher because they typically have standard stock. But again, there may be opportunities. There may be opportunities available. I'm not intimately familiar. I do remember there were some issues with the technology about 10 years ago, in terms of sometimes the recycled paper would jam the Xerox duplex kind of printer that was connected to my espresso book machine in the printer, and so you may run into some issues, or they may exist. But I believe that the technology has probably gotten better since then. I can't speak to how broadly available that is at all services, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that would be definitely in terms of reducing carbon footprint, it would be an additional value to be able to use recycled paper for sure.
Oh, for sure. I mean, destroying the books and using recycled paper would be, amazing.
Yeah, for sure. There's one more question, and I think I'm piecing it together well. It's about pricing structure and POD. So one of the attendees is asking about, I'll see if I can get it a little bit more specifically. They're saying, well, counterintuitive, they found that their sales via Ingram did not increase much. And so they were already, they're wondering if you could speak to that.
Sales at Ingram, even through print on demand, didn't increase?
Yes, that's what much when discounted at 40%, and it stayed nearly the same at 24%. So if you could speak a little bit more about that.
I'm not sure. So is that because the higher cost of the print on demand version versus the I'm guessing?
I'm guessing it's hard to, yes, I'm trying to piece it together.
It's going to be a tough one because the economies of scale are such that when there's a huge volume of orders and you're going to need 1,000 or 500 or something like that, the costs are going to be lower when you're not using print on demand or using offset. But I always look at it from the point of view of people are flight risks. Purchasers of books are flight risks. In this society where we can turn things on and have instant access to stuff. I often look at that. If it's not available and they have to wait, we may not even get a sale. So rather than looking, I'm an optimist. I tend to look at, or maybe that's a pessimist when you think about it, like you're going to lose the sale or you're going to make smaller margin. And I would rather take the smaller margin over the lost sales. Again, having run struggling indie bookstore businesses, just trying desperately to fight the Amazons of the world and all of the big the powers that be, dealing in really, really small margins. I would rather get a small margin than nothing, because 40% of zero is zero, or whatever that margin typically is. I don't know if that helps. So I always consider what the alternative is: lost sale or a minimal margin, and I tend to go for that minimal margin.
Okay, great. I think so. I think perhaps it's a question we could take offline afterwards.
I'd love to chat about that in more detail and maybe understand what point I'm actually not picking up on.
Yes, and then one final question was, could you please repeat the names of the print-on-demand distributors in Canada?
No, well, this is the ones I've played with. So M and T, so the number, the letter M, ampersand T, printing in Kitchener-Waterloo, and Rapido. So it's like rapid with O on the end of it. Let's see if I can, Rapido. Leave books. So obviously quite bilingual. They are a Montreal-based company. As a matter of fact, I just got a phone call from them while I was doing the call because I sent them a print job of something that I'm hoping to get next week. Those are two of the companies that I've worked with, and what I really like about them is some of the flexibility because they're smaller. I mean, I love Ingram, and Ingram provides amazing distribution, etc. And there is no real the challenge is there's no significant print-on-demand system that covers all of Canada. You've got a lot of really great regional publishers. I know there's some great publishers in BC and Edmonton that are doing print-on-demand stuff. And there's these guys that I've worked with locally. I know there's some great publishers and printers in Ottawa as well, and I can't remember the name, but I know there's some great ones, and even some of my colleagues who run bookstores in Kitchener have used them to get really fast shipments of print-on-demand titles. But I strongly encourage you to check them out. Those are just some examples of the ones I've used, and I know they're willing to work with people from across the country. I know Rapido works with publishers across the country, and prevents you from. So, for example, if you're a publisher on the West Coast, and instead of shipping it all the way from BC to somebody in Toronto, you could potentially have it shipped from Montreal from them for like a one-off shipping for cheaper, and vice versa, right? Potentially if you've partnered. Now that does require, again, having relationships with multiple printers, because there isn't a single Canadian source for all distribution for print on demand, unfortunately.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that's the end of the questions for now, but I believe you have your contact information available on the next slide if anybody wants to send you.
Oh, thank you. I forgot about that.
No problem. we were deep in the QA session. So if anybody wants to send you an email with their questions or for further clarification, please go ahead. Or if you'd like to send me an email at ghvery@Canada that you'd like me to forward on to Mark, or about any aspect of the webinar, we always appreciate your feedback and are happy to answer more questions where possible. So thank you very much, Mark. We appreciate your being here today. We appreciate all of you. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties some of you were experiencing logging on, and I thank you again for your patience and perseverance. And I'd also like to thank the Government of Canada, the Canada Book Fund, for funding this event. At the end of the webinar, once you log off, you should you should be redirected to an evaluation, a SurveyMonkey, that's what it's called. Anyway, you should be sent off to an evaluation link. Please fill it out. As I mentioned before, your feedback is really valuable to us, and it's really important for us to know what kind of information is the best for you. So thanks again to everybody. I'm wishing you all a great week, and we'll chat again soon. Thank you.